She stepped off the train into the freezing Colorado wind. A 200-pound bride sold to a mountain man the town called a cold-blooded demon. Abigail expected brutality and a short life. Instead, in that isolated cabin, she uncovered a chilling conspiracy and a gentle giant whose terrifying reputation was a meticulously crafted lie. The year was 1883, and for Abigail Higgins, the gilded cages of Philadelphia high society felt more like a slaughterhouse. At 24 years old, she was a stark contrast to the aesthetic demands of her aristocratic family, where her younger sister, Clara, was slender, porcelain-skinned, and highly sought after by senators and banking heirs. Abigail was heavy-set, plain-spoken, and deemed entirely unmarriageable. At over 200 pounds, she was the shame of Josiah Higgins, a ruthless shipping magnate who viewed his daughters solely as assets to be traded. Abigail's intelligence, her knack for numbers, and her quiet resilience meant nothing in a world that only valued a 1/6-inch waist. The betrayal happened on a Tuesday evening in Josiah's mahogany-paneled study. He slid a piece of heavy parchment across his desk, not meeting her eyes. "You are leaving for Colorado at the end of the week," her father stated, his voice devoid of warmth. "I have arranged a proxy marriage. His name is Soren Montgomery. He owns a substantial timber claim near a town called Bitter Creek. You will sign the marriage certificate now, and you will not return." Abigail's heart plummeted. She had heard of the mail-order brides sent west, usually desperate women with nothing left to lose. "Father, please," she whispered, her hands trembling. "I can stay in the servants' wing. I won't attend the galas. I won't embarrass you. You are a blight on Clara's prospects." He interrupted coldly. "The Montgomery man asked for a strong woman who can survive the winters. I paid him a dowry of $2,000 to take you off my hands. Sign it, Abigail." A week later, Abigail was on the Union Pacific Railroad, watching the civilized world blur into jagged, hostile wilderness. The journey was agonizing. Her heavy woolen dresses felt suffocating, and the constant jolting of the train battered her bruised spirit. But the true terror began when the locomotive finally hissed to a halt in Bitter Creek, a miserable, mud-soaked mining camp nestled in the shadows of the Rocky Mountains. The town was a collection of raw timber buildings, smelling of sulfur, stale whiskey, and desperation. As Abigail stepped onto the platform, dragging her heavy trunk, the locals stopped and stared. It wasn't just her size that drew their eyes. It was the name on her trunk. A man with a silver star pinned to his vest approached her. He had a sallow face and eyes like chipped flint. "You, the Higgins woman?" he asked, spitting tobacco into the slush. "I'm Sheriff Ezekiel Cobb." "I am," Abigail said, trying to stand tall despite the freezing wind biting through her coat. "I am looking for my husband." Soren Montgomery. The name seemed to suck the air out of the bustling platform. Several miners turned away, muttering. Sheriff Cobb let out a low, humorless whistle. "Montgomery? Lady, your folks back east must hate you something awful. I don't understand." Abigail faltered. Cobb stepped closer, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial, sinister rasp. "Soren Montgomery is a savage, a mountain brute. Last winter, he nearly beat a prospector to death with his bare hands just for crossing his property line. The man's got a demon temper. He lives up on Blood Ridge, and nobody goes up there. Not even the law. His last partner disappeared a year ago, and we all know Soren put him in the dirt." Abigail's blood turned to ice. She had expected a rough frontiersman, perhaps a poor farmer. She had not expected a murderer. I have nowhere else to go," she whispered, a tear finally escaping her eye. Cobb signaled a grizzled wagon driver. "Old Man Miller will take you to the base of the ridge. After that, you walk. And lady? Don't look him in the eye when he's drinking." The wagon ride was a blur of terror. Every bump in the road felt like a step closer to her own execution. Old Man Miller refused to drive past the tree line, dumping her trunk in the snow at the base of a steep, treacherous trail. "God be with you, Mrs. Montgomery," the old man mumbled, crossing himself before whipping his mules around and fleeing back toward town. Left entirely alone in the dying light, Abigail looked up at the looming, snow-choked mountain. She was exhausted, freezing, and terrified. But as the bitter wind howled through the pines, a strange, stubborn ember ignited in her chest. Her father had sent her here to die. The town expected her to be a victim. Gritting her teeth, Abigail grabbed the thick leather handle of her trunk. She began the agonizing climb up Blood Ridge, dragging her life behind her. The altitude and her own weight were brutal enemies. By the time Abigail reached the clearing near the summit, night had fallen. Her lungs burned, her fine Philadelphia boots were soaked through, and her hands were bleeding from gripping the trunk's handle. Through the swirling snow, she saw it. A massive, sturdy log cabin with golden light spilling from the windows. It didn't look like a murderer's hovel. It looked solid, well-crafted, and warm. Before she could knock, the heavy oak door swung open. Abigail stumbled back, her breath catching in her throat. The man standing in the doorway was a giant. Soren Montgomery stood well over 6.5 feet tall, his shoulders broad enough to block the light from the cabin. He wore a thick wolfskin coat, and a rugged, dark beard concealed the lower half of his face. But what caught the moonlight was the jagged, silver scar running from his left temple down to his jawline. He stared at her, his dark eyes unreadable. Abigail froze, waiting for the demon to strike, waiting for the rage she had been warned about. She instinctively raised a hand to protect her face. Soren looked from her raised, trembling hand to her bleeding fingers, and then down to the massive trunk she had dragged up a mountain in the dead of winter. A flicker of something crossed his eyes. Not anger, but shock. Without a word, he stepped out into the blizzard. Abigail squeezed her eyes shut, but the blow never came. She opened her eyes to see Soren casually lifting her 200-pound trunk onto one shoulder, as if it were a sack of feathers. Inside, his voice was a deep, gravelly baritone. But it wasn't a yell. It was a calm instruction. "You'll freeze to death out here." Abigail scurried inside, overwhelmed by the sudden rush of heat. The cabin was immaculate. The hardwood floors were swept. A massive stone fireplace crackled with dry pine, and the smell of roasted venison and rosemary filled the air. This was not the lair of a chaotic beast. Soren set her trunk down gently in the corner. He shrugged off his heavy coat, revealing a simple flannel shirt stretched tight over a massive, muscular frame. He walked over to a cast-iron stove, poured a steaming mug of coffee, and walked back to her. He held it out. Abigail reached for it, but her hands were shaking so violently from the cold and the adrenaline that she fumbled. The hot coffee splashed over her wrists, and the mug shattered on the floor. "I'm sorry," she gasped, instantly dropping to her knees, terrified that this clumsiness would trigger the demon's wrath. "I'm so sorry. Please don't hit me. I'll clean it up." "Stop." The single word halted her. Soren knelt down beside her. His massive, calloused hands reached out, and Abigail flinched. But he only bypassed her to pick up the broken shards of ceramic. "You're bleeding," he said quietly. He stood up, grabbed a clean cloth from a basin, and soaked it in warm water. He knelt back down, and, with shocking gentleness, began to wipe the blood and spilled coffee from her freezing hands. "I don't hit women," Soren said, his voice low and steady. "And I don't hit strangers. Whoever told you otherwise lied." Abigail stared at the top of his head, bewildered. "Sheriff Cobb," she stammered. He said you nearly killed a man. He said you have a demon temper." Soren's hands paused for a fraction of a second, a muscle feathering in his scarred jaw. "Ezekiel Cobb has a big mouth and a small conscience," Soren replied, standing up and tossing the cloth into a bucket. "Come sit by the fire. I'll get you some stew." For the next 2 days, the tension in the cabin was palpable, but not because of violence. It was the tension of shattered expectations. Soren was a man of very few words, but his actions spoke volumes. He gave Abigail the cabin's only bedroom, choosing to sleep on a bedroll by the hearth. He never once mocked her size or her appetite. In fact, he silently doubled her portions of food, noticing how her father's dietary restrictions had left her malnourished despite her weight. Abigail began to realize that the demon of Bloodridge was a phantom. But if Soren was this gentle, solitary man, why was the whole town terrified of him? The answer arrived on the morning of her third day. A loud, aggressive pounding echoed on the cabin door. Soren, who was whittling a piece of cedar by the fire, instantly went still. His posture shifted. The gentle giant vanished, replaced by a coiled, lethal predator. He reached to the mantel and pulled down a heavy Winchester rifle. "Stay in the bedroom," Soren ordered Abigail, his voice dropping an octave, raw and dangerous. Abigail didn't listen. She cracked the bedroom door open just enough to see. Soren kicked the front door open. Standing in the snow were Sheriff Ezekiel Cobb and 3 armed deputies. "Morning, Soren," Cobb sneered, though Abigail could see the sheriff kept a cautious distance from the porch. "We've got a problem. The town council reassessed your property lines. Turns out, the lower half of your timber, claim the part sitting right over that new silver vein, actually belongs to the county. You have no jurisdiction up here, Cobb," Soren growled. His voice was terrifying now, a booming, vicious snarl that perfectly matched the rumors. "You step foot on my claim, I'll bury you under it. Now, Soren, don't let that demon temper flare up," Cobb mocked, gesturing to his deputies. "We have a legal writ. You resist, we shoot you down like the rabid dog you are." Soren didn't shout. He didn't wave his arms. In a blur of motion so fast, Abigail barely registered it. Soren racked the lever of the Winchester and fired a single shot. The bullet struck the silver star cleanly off Ezekiel Cobb's chest, ripping it from his vest without touching a single drop of the sheriff's skin. The deafening crack echoed off the mountains. The deputies scrambled backward in absolute terror, dropping their weapons in the snow. Cobb fell flat on his back, pale as a ghost, clutching his chest to ensure he was still alive. "The next one goes through your teeth," Soren roared, stepping out onto the porch, looking every inch the legendary monster of Bitter Creek. "Get off my mountain." The men didn't hesitate. They scrambled to their horses and rode off as if the devil himself were chasing them. Soren stood on the porch until they were out of sight. Then he lowered the rifle, closed the door, and leaned his head against the heavy wood. The terrifying posture melted away. He let out a long, exhausted sigh, his hands trembling slightly as he set the rifle back on the mantel. Abigail stepped out of the bedroom, her heart hammering. She finally understood. "You missed on purpose," she whispered. Soren turned to look at her, the dark circles under his eyes prominent in the morning light. "They want my land," Soren said quietly, walking back to his chair and picking up his whittling knife as if nothing had happened. "My brother, Thomas, he found silver on the lower ridge 2 years ago," Cobb found out. A week later, Thomas was found dead in an accident in town. Abigail gasped, pressing a hand to her mouth. "The partner who disappeared was my brother," Soren confirmed, his voice thick with unwept grief. "Cobb killed him. And Cobb has the judges and the town council in his pocket. If I went to the law, I'd be dead too. So you became a monster." Abigail realized aloud, the pieces falling together. "You let them think you're a violent, unpredictable demon." Soren looked up at her, his dark eyes vulnerable for the first time. "A corrupt sheriff isn't afraid of a peaceful man asking for justice, Abigail, but they are terrified of a crazy brute who might snap their necks in the dark. The demon temper is the only thing keeping them from taking my land and putting me in the ground next to my brother." He looked away, staring into the fire. "Your father wanted to throw you away, so he sent you to a monster. I needed the dowry money to buy ammunition and supplies to hold out through the winter. I'm sorry you got dragged into a war." Abigail looked at this massive, scarred man. She had spent her whole life surrounded by civilized gentlemen in Philadelphia who wore tailored suits but possessed the souls of cruel beasts. Now, she was standing in front of a supposed beast who possessed the soul of a gentleman. She walked over to the fire, picked up the coffee pot, and poured him a fresh cup. She handed it to him, and this time, her hands didn't shake. "I'm not sorry," Abigail said, her voice finding a strength she didn't know she had. "If we are going to war with Ezekiel Cobb, Mr. Montgomery, we are going to need more coffee." The brutal Colorado winter sealed Blood Ridge off from the rest of the world, transforming the cabin into a solitary fortress of pine and stone. For Abigail Higgins, the isolation was not a prison, but a sanctuary. Away from the sneering judgments of Philadelphia society, she began to shed the heavy mantle of shame her father had forced upon her. Here, her size was not a moral failing. It was a mechanism for survival. She chopped firewood, hauled heavy buckets of water from the half-frozen creek, and helped Soren reinforce the cabin's weak points. The mountain demanded strength, and for the first time in her life, Abigail realized she had it in abundance. Soren watched her transformation in quiet awe. He had expected a fragile, weeping socialite who would wither in the cold. Instead, he found a woman whose resilience mirrored the very mountains surrounding them. They fell into a comfortable, unspoken rhythm. In the evenings, while the blizzard howled against the shutters, they sat by the roaring fire. It was during one of these quiet nights in early December that Abigail took the first step toward dismantling the conspiracy of Bitter Creek. "Soren," she said, looking up from her mending, "your brothers claim—" "Do you have the original assay reports and the deed?" Soren paused, his whittling knife hovering over a piece of cedar. "I keep them in a lockbox under the floorboards." "Why? Before my father exiled me, I ran the accounting ledgers for his shipping empire." Abigail explained, her voice steady. "He never let anyone know, of course. It wouldn't do for a woman to be seen doing a man's mathematics. But I know contracts. I know federal property law. If Sheriff Cobb is using the town council to reassess your borders, he's relying on a legal loophole. I want to see if he actually has one." Soren stared at her, the flickering firelight casting deep shadows over his scarred face. Without a word, he set his carving aside, pried up a loose floorboard near the hearth, and retrieved a heavy iron lockbox. He handed her a stack of yellowed, fragile documents. For 3 nights, Abigail pored over the papers by the light of a kerosene lamp. She cross-referenced Thomas Montgomery's geographical coordinates with the crude maps Soren had drawn. She calculated the pitch and dip of the silver vein her brother-in-law had struck. On the 4th night, she slammed her hand down on the table, a triumphant spark in her eyes. "He's lying," Abigail breathed, looking up at Soren. "Cobb's entire reassessment is a fabrication. Thomas filed this deed under the General Mining Act of 1872. It grants you apex rights. Because the top edge of the silver vein surfaces entirely within your property lines, you have the exclusive right to mine it, even if the vein dips beneath county land." Soren stepped closer, looking over her shoulder at the complex web of numbers and legal jargon she had scrawled on a scrap piece of paper. "Cobb knows I can't read legal print," Soren muttered, his jaw tightening. "He knew I wouldn't understand the apex law. He just needed to bully me off the land, or provoke me into a fight so he could hang me. But he didn't count on you having a wife who reads federal statutes," Abigail said, a fierce protective anger rising in her chest. "Soren, a local magistrate in Bitter Creek is useless. Cobb owns them. But if we can get these documents to Denver, to a federal judge like Moses Hallett, Cobb's reassessment will be struck down, and we can demand a federal investigation into Thomas's death." Soren looked at her, his dark eyes tracing the determined set of her jaw. The hardened, defensive walls he had built around himself for 2 years began to crumble. He reached out, his massive, calloused hand gently tracing the side of her face. It was the first time he had touched her with such deliberate tenderness. "You are the most extraordinary creature I have ever met," Soren whispered, his deep voice trembling slightly. "Josiah Higgins was a fool to let you go." Abigail's breath caught. She looked up into his eyes, seeing past the terrifying scar and the rough beard, straight into the soul of a man who cherished her exactly as she was. "How did you get the scar, Soren?" she asked softly, leaning into his touch. Soren swallowed hard. "The night I found Thomas, his body was dumped behind the saloon. Cobb and 2 of his deputies were there. They claimed he fell off a wagon while drunk. Thomas didn't drink. I lost my mind. I went for Cobb, but a deputy caught me with a skinning knife. He traced the jagged silver line on his jaw. That was the night the demon of Bloodridge was born. I realized that if I acted like a madman, if I made them believe I would slaughter them in their sleep, they would stay away from the cabin until I could figure out what to do. "You don't have to be a demon anymore," Abigail said, covering his massive hand with hers. "We will fight them together. With the law. We have to survive the winter first," Soren replied grimly. "Cobb won't wait for the spring thaw. The moment the snow breaks, a federal surveyor is due in the territory. Cobb knows he has to eliminate me before that surveyor checks these coordinates." He was right. The war was coming to their doorstep, and the law of the mountains was far more brutal than the law of the courtroom. By mid-January, the temperature plummeted to 30 below zero. The snowdrifts piled halfway up the cabin windows, plunging the interior into a perpetual claustrophobic twilight. Soren grew restless, pacing the floorboards, his Winchester rifle never leaving his side. He had begun setting tripwires in the tree line and barricading the heavy oak door with iron brackets. The assault came on a moonless Tuesday night, masked by the deafening roar of a fresh blizzard. Abigail was asleep in the bedroom when the first gunshot shattered the silence. The window in the main room exploded inward, showering the wooden floor with deadly shards of glass and freezing wind. "Abigail, get down!" Soren roared. She rolled off the mattress, hitting the floor just as a second bullet tore through the thin bedroom wall, spraying sawdust over her head. She crawled into the main room, her heart hammering against her ribs. Soren was crouched behind the overturned heavy dining table, his rifle barking into the darkness. The flash of the muzzle illuminated his face, feral, focused, and terrifying. He wasn't shooting blindly. He was waiting for the muzzle flashes from the tree line and returning fire with deadly, calculated precision. "How many?" Abigail shouted over the roaring wind. "At least 5, Soren yelled back, racking the lever of the Winchester. Cobb brought hired guns, mercenaries from the lower camps. Another volley of gunfire tore into the cabin. The cast-iron stove took a direct hit, violently ringing like a dark bell. Smoke and ash began to fill the room, stinging Abigail's eyes. This was not a legal dispute anymore. It was an execution. Cobb intended to burn them out, or shoot them down, leaving nothing but frozen corpses for the spring thaw. "Stay behind the hearth," Soren ordered, moving toward the broken window to get a better angle. As he shifted his weight, the front door violently splintered. A heavy battering ram, a chopped pine log swung by 2 men, smashed into the oak. The iron brackets groaned, twisting under the immense force. Soren turned, aiming his rifle at the door, but a shot rang out from the broken window. Soren grunted, a short, sharp sound of agony, and fell backward. His rifle clattered across the floorboards. "Soren!" Abigail screamed, scrambling out from behind the stone hearth. She grabbed his arm, pulling his massive frame back behind the safety of the overturned table. Blood was rapidly soaking through the shoulder of his flannel shirt. The bullet had caught him cleanly under the collarbone. He was pale, gritting his teeth in immense pain. But he tried to reach for his boot knife. "I can't. My right arm," he gasped, his fingers clumsy and numb. Before Abigail could stem the bleeding, the front door finally gave way with an explosive crack. The freezing storm howled into the cabin, bringing with it 3 figures coated in snow. Sheriff Ezekiel Cobb stepped over the threshold, a double-barreled shotgun leveled at the floor. Two heavily armed mercenaries flanked him, their faces wrapped in wool scarves. "Well, well," Cobb sneered, stepping over the shattered timber. He looked down at Soren, bleeding on the floor, and let out a cold, triumphant laugh. The great demon of Bloodridge, brought low in his own den. "I told you, Montgomery, you can't fight the law." Abigail knelt over Soren, her hands pressing desperately against his bleeding shoulder. She looked up at Cobb, her eyes blazing with a hatred so pure, it momentarily startled the corrupt sheriff. "You aren't the law," Abigail spat. "You're a thief and a murderer, and Judge Hallett in Denver will hang you for it." Cobb's smile vanished. His eyes darted to the loose floorboards near the hearth, where the heavy lockbox sat partially exposed. "You've been reading his mail, Mrs. Montgomery?" Cobb stepped forward, his boots crunching on the broken glass. "That's a shame. I was planning on letting the tragic, widowed bride freeze to death on her way back to town. But if you know about the Apex rights, I suppose you'll have to catch a stray bullet from the mercenaries who robbed your husband." He raised the shotgun, aiming it squarely at Abigail's chest. Soren let out a roar of absolute fury, trying to lunge forward, but his shattered shoulder betrayed him. He collapsed back against the floorboards, helpless. Abigail didn't scream. She didn't cower. As Cobb's finger tightened on the trigger, the instincts of survival that Bloodridge had forged within her took absolute control. She realized Cobb had made a fatal miscalculation. He was standing too close, underestimating her, because she was a woman, and judging her as clumsy and slow because of her size. With an explosive surge of adrenaline, Abigail didn't reach for a weapon. She used the only weapon she had left, herself. She drove her legs against the floorboards and launched her entire 200-pound frame directly at the sheriff. Cobb fired, but Abigail's sudden movement threw off his aim. The shotgun blast tore harmlessly into the ceiling timbers. Before he could cock the second barrel, Abigail's shoulder slammed into his chest with the force of a runaway freight train. The impact was devastating. The air rushed out of Cobb's lungs in a violent wheeze. Abigail's sheer weight and momentum carried them both backward. Cobb's boots lost their purchase on the icy floorboards. He flew backward, crashing through the remains of the shattered doorway and out onto the porch. Abigail didn't stop. She rode him to the ground, bringing her heavy knee down squarely onto his right wrist. A sickening crack echoed over the wind, followed by Cobb's agonizing scream. The shotgun skittered off the edge of the porch into the deep snow. The two mercenaries in the cabin froze, stunned by the sheer brutality and speed of the woman they had dismissed as a fat, useless bride. That second of hesitation was all Soren needed. Operating purely on adrenaline and left-handed desperation, he had scooped up his fallen Winchester. "Drop them!" Soren roared from the floor, the rifle leveled steadily at the closest mercenary's head. "Or I blow you to hell." Looking at the bleeding, enraged giant on the floor, and hearing their employer shrieking in agony outside, the mercenaries made the only smart choice. They dropped their revolvers, raised their hands, and slowly backed out of the shattered door, disappearing into the blizzard. Abigail dragged a whimpering, broken Cobb back into the cabin by his coat collar. She threw him against the stone hearth, grabbing one of the dropped revolvers and aiming it directly between his eyes. She was panting, her nightgown torn and covered in Soren's blood. But she looked like an avenging angel of the mountains. The demon temper was a lie. Abigail told the terrified sheriff, her voice deadly calm. "Soren is a good man. I, however, am a Higgins, and my father taught me how to ruin a man." She lowered the gun slightly, looking over at Soren. He was leaning against the overturned table, a weak, incredulous smile spreading across his pale, scarred face. They had won the battle, but with Soren severely wounded and a shattered cabin letting in the deadly cold, the true test of their survival had just begun. The wind screamed through the shattered doorway, violently dropping the cabin's temperature to a lethal degree. Abigail had no time for panic. survival required absolute cold-blooded pragmatism. Ripping the clean linen of her remaining petticoats into strips